Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Haven Knox-Johnston winterising webinar, which is easier to say than I thought it was going to be, on coastal vessels. Just give you a little bit of a background. Haven Knox-Johnston is a boat insurance company that's been around since 1986 in various guises, and this is all part of our sort of Haven Helpful Hints series, which kind of on our YouTube. And the webinar is basically made up of a series of videos which are filmed. It was raining at the time, so you'll have to forgive us on that one. But it's a series of videos about each area of the boat, which Ben will talk us through. And we'll sort of just go through them all, and there'll be question and answer sessions. There'll be a big question and answer session at the end, but obviously if you have any questions that come up during each video, then please just either go into the question and answer chat and post a question on there, and obviously if not, then raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question in person. Just to introduce you to Ben is a marine surveyor, a highly respected marine surveyor who's been around the industry for about 40 years, and I know he doesn't look old enough, but it is true, he is that experienced. So he started off in boat building, has built boats in GRP, timber, steel, all sorts of materials. And in the last 20 years, or 20 years plus, I suppose it is now, Ben, you've been a surveyor who is a full member of the YBDSA now, and also a member of the British Marine Federation, and also the Canal Boat Builders Association.
But we don't worry about that on coastal boats, Paul.
Yeah, we don't worry about that.
Everyone. I'm also a member of SCMS, which is another surveying association as well.
So hugely respected, hugely qualified, and hugely experienced, which is what we kind of want. If it's what we want when we're trying to get across the importance of what we're trying to get to put into place with regard to winterizing your vessels. As I say, it's a series of videos. They're going to last about 30 to 45 minutes with Ben talking through them. And so without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Ben, and we're going to start the video. So over to you, Ben.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. It's always great to see how many people have actually joined this sort of webinar. I'm always amazed that anyone who actually wants to listen to me drone on. So with no further ado, basically, we've tried to do this in such a way that we're trying to think about whether your boat is afloat or ashore, and whether it's a motorboat or a yacht. So some things may not be quite applicable to you, but winterizing of a boat ashore, for instance, and afloat, it's really important that you try and protect things like the water ingress. So I think probably the most important one to start with probably is the cockpit drains, because whether the boat is afloat or ashore, that's an area that does cause quite a lot of problems.
And so with the cockpit again, the water's got to go somewhere. So obviously you've got to check the drains again, or?
Absolutely, and it's essential on a boat where there is no overboard direct drainage, like on some yachts where they've got open sugar scoops. This one has quite a small set of drainage, in the sense that the drains are actually in the recess here for the ship's wheel. They're quite large down there, but from a point of view of water accumulating, if you get leaves or you get somewhere where you're ashore and they get blocked, or the boat is angled wrong, water could pool in the front of this if the boat is not correctly stacked ashore. So it's really important that if she's ashore, she's correctly raked, and likewise if she's left here, that you make sure those sort of things are clear and not blocked, because obviously you've only got to have 3 or 4 inches of water before it starts coming through with the bottom of that companionway cover dropped off.
And over one of our winters, that's quite easily doable.
It's very doable in most places, even in the Mediterranean. They get a lot of rain in the winter. Okay, so hopefully that shows you a couple of things. I always find it incredible. I've had a real big learning curve on winterization, because I'm very fortunate that we finally got our own boat out to Corfu last year, and I had to leave ashore for quite a few months a year, because obviously we're going to go out for the summer, and try to make sure that the yard get the boat absolutely completely level ashore, because she's the centre cockpit. Is so important, because everyone thinks Corfu's sunny in the summer, but my goodness me, the rain you get in the winter. I've been there where some people's yachts have had the tree debris land inside the cockpits and fill them up, and they turn up in the spring and they find there's 2 foot of water inside the boat. So it's really, really, I can't emphasize how important it is to make sure your boat, when it's ashore or left afloat, the cockpit drains are clear and the boat it actually works correctly. So that's another one we'll just have a look at quickly now is the anodes. Again, if you're going to keep your boat in the water for more than a period of 9 to 12 months, it should come out at some point to have a look at some of these anodes. Anodes, there's been a big change in thought on anodes in the last couple of years, where people have been putting zinc on for salt water and aluminium for brackish and magnesium for where you're in fresh. Now, what's really noticeable is certainly where I live up in South Wales, a lot of our marinas have gone from being brackish to almost fresh through the winter because of the amount of storm drains that now go into the marina areas. And indeed, even in some of the tidal areas, like where we were when we were doing the filming, the top of the handle, for instance, will turn brackish for a good period of the tidal holding, as it were, where the anodes will shut off. And those videos, again, I'll just run through a couple of those. I'll just wait for it to restart. But with the anodes, if you find that you've got anodes which have got almost like a crust on them, that's a very good indication, like this one here on that one there. If I can just stop that one. Yeah, I think we've managed to stop it. You can actually see this crust forming over the top of the anode. And that is from the fact that the anode is shutting off because it's sitting in the wrong water type. Now, what's quite interesting is a lot of the anode manufacturers are now saying it's actually better to use aluminium in salt as well as fresh. So if you are going to leave, there's another classic one there of the anode shutting off. That one there, let's just pause that one. And again, you can see that shaft anode is completely shut off. So if you are going to leave your boat in the water for a good period of time, just be very aware of the galvanic protection of your boat through the winter. It's really important in the summer, but obviously in the winter you might be leaving it for 6 or 7 months, not using it, and you're just relying on those anodes to protect yourself. And we're seeing an increasing number of claims now across the board from galvanic damage where the anodes are completely shut off. I've probably rambled on too long on that one, but again, if you want to ask questions about anodes, please do. When you're out the water, don't forget that a lot of them have a mild steel fastening through them, through the hull, which if you leave it for 5 or 6 months will corrode quite nicely. And when you go to put the boat back in the water in the spring, you will probably find that the anode is shut off. So it's a matter of using an ohms meter or multimeter set onto ohms and make sure you've got a very low resistance. I mean, ideally 0.2 of an ohm is what you're looking for between the anode and the shaft and the rudder blade or any other hangings you've got, like P brackets. Okay, so another classic one is mooring lines, where we have. So Paul, when you're coming to look at moorings in the winter, it's really important to make sure that things can't chafe. For instance, through the fair leads, these are fairly tidy fair leads, but even these have had a bit of overloading. You can see some light cracking in the deck teak. The fastening itself is a fit, but again, it's really important to try and ensure that you should prevent the wear through with the ropes. And again, I'm not a great one for seeing ropes backed off like that on the cleat down there. Okay.
But when leaving the boat, doubling up the lines, is that a good idea?
I think it's a great idea. I would also seriously think about a second line coming off the boat somewhere as just a checker, especially if you're leaving it for long periods of time, especially a boat this size. Yeah, so on that one, we found that the cleat had been actually backed off, and literally they'd taken a round turn on one side of the cleat, which creates a really great friction point to start wearing ropes. I much prefer seeing a cleat working in the direction of the rope, taking a full turn around it, a couple of figure of eights. Everyone talks about OXO, a couple of figure of eights, and another full turn. And then if you're then going to back it off, then fine, put it back on. But backing off on the first one is a great point of overloading, and it will fracture a rope quite smartly. Another little great tip is if you're driving down the road and see anyone who's chucked their leather sofa out on the side of the road, go out there with a Stanley knife and cut a couple of bits of the back of the leather sofa out and use them as protectors on through your fair leads and stuff. Anything like that, or rags or something will stop that chafing. It's quite surprising how quickly a rope will chafe. In marinas, a lot of marinas do monitor the boats and keep an eye on them, and it's amazing how quickly you hear that lines have been replaced on boats after sort of 2 or 3 months. And with UV light, we were getting more and more ropes these days deteriorate with UV light, so don't rely on the same rope every year. So I think the other one down at the bottom where we haven't done is the deck fittings and hatches, isn't it? So again, we talk about deck fittings first of all. Quite often you'll find that some of these things can be loose. I actually found the handrail on the front of this boat is actually very slightly loose, so any water running down has got a chance of tracking into the accommodation below. But again, things like dobbles are really great, and it's worth trying to make sure you turn them into the prevailing winds through the winter. I know some people go absolutely nuts with me if I'm saying that, but forcing air into the boat through the winter is a great thing to do, really, unless you're running dehumidifiers. But really, good ventilation through a boat is the key to looking after it.
And so what about the hatches?
Well, on this particular boat, it hasn't got any vents on it, on any of them, and they're all nice and turn quite tightly down. So again, it is worth checking that the seals are okay, and the silicone grease is good. But again, things like these, sometimes you may find these are loose and will let a little bit of moisture in, so it's worth checking to make sure they're secure. But a lot of them do have vents on, and again, quite often you find that the vents have been stood on and damaged, so they're not actually making a watertight seal.
Oh, okay.
So it's well worth having a look at those. Okay, so one of the things I'll say about the loose deck fittings on a yacht, or a motorboat for that matter, is a lot of our production boats in GRP rely on a balsa core deck. And while you may not notice a moisture issue coming through into the linings, there will be an issue of the balsa core starting to get wet. And I have in my normal talk that I do at boat shows and sailing clubs, I have got some wonderful samples of balsa core where someone's fitted a clam cleat or a pulley block or even just a little hook for a boat hook, and over a period of time that area of deck has absorbed absolutely loads of moisture, and then it's gone completely soft. And what's even worse is, as we go through the winter, we get sub-zero temperatures, the actual laminate and the balsa core being forced apart by the moisture inside expanding, and then come the summer, you're getting a free trampoline on your foredeck, for instance. So those are the sort of things we've got there.
And obviously, Ben, as the water gets into that core, that can seriously, if it then freezes and everything like that, that can seriously damage it.
Absolutely, yeah. And you're talking about megabucks to try and put it right. It's really important to make sure all the deck fittings are checked and not loose. If you're fitting fittings in the future, make sure you put them down on a proper bedding mastic. And also make sure that internally, where you're screwing things onto the deck, that there's something proper to support it, rather than just bolting through the balsa core, which will cause problems for you in the future or a future owner. With deck hatches, it's really important to make sure that where you've got the seals, that they're all nice and clean and well maintained, and the use of a silicone grease. My dad in the old days used to say Vaseline, but everyone swears at me for saying the word Vaseline. Or petroleum jelly, but I mean, I've done it for 40 odd years like that. But when I went out to Corfu, I sailed our yacht, which I left Port Napoleon, and we basically managed to buy an amazing French product, which was almost like a liquid wax, but it was more like a liquid wax jelly, and I've used that for the last couple of years on fittings and things that open and shut all the time, and I've had no water in my cabin at all, which is wonderful. Right, shall we kick on with the next one? Yeah, head sails. Yeah, let's go for head sails.
And what about the furling headsail? Anything to do with that? Or?
Okay, right. Me personally, I think you're far better off taking your sails off. You deal with a lot of claims on where furlers are broken open through the winter. And I do accept a lot of people love going out for a sail in the winter, but you've really got to start working out if you're going to do that or not, because you're double the life of your sails if you take them off in the winter. And also it's a good time to check the swivel right at the top of the mast on the roller, because that's notorious for jamming over periods of a long time. And again, it is normally a condition of insurance that there's a secondary rope round here. Not with all insurance companies, but most of them insist on something secondary done on here. So if the roller furling halyard line here breaks, this isn't going to roll open and basically open the sail and flog itself to death.
Yeah, I've seen a few of them out in the harbours in the middle of winter with their old sails flapping around and all that
Yeah,
sort of stuff. So
yeah.
yes, no, it's always good to try and avoid that.
Yes, and I bet you enjoy paying for them.
No, we don't enjoy paying for them.
They don't pay for them. Most insurance companies don't pay for them, so it's something well worth doing. And likewise with the main here, you can see this has actually been left like this behind us, where they've actually, the cover hasn't been fully zipped on.
Oh, okay, that's quite bad because obviously the weather is getting to that sail already.
Yeah, yeah. I should have brought a coat with me as well. Yeah. I'm a fair weather surveyor, as you can see from that one. But it's really interesting because a lot of boat yards now, before you have your boat lifted out of the water, will certainly expect the boat to have the sails taken off, or at least the genoa. In most of the yards I deal with here in South Wales and certainly down the south coast, it's becoming more and more of an insistence that those sort of things are removed. And it's also a good time to check the rest of your rigging. And it's like, if you have on your cap shrouds little PVC protectors, it's well worth taking them off and washing the lowers and the caps where you can, to make sure you get rid of all the debris and rubbish out of the stranded wires. So there we are. I hope that's okay. We'll go and have a quick look in the anchor lockers, shall we? I don't know if yeah, your mouse is working better faster than mine, Kate. So this one's got a tidy anchor chain on here, and all the galvanising is quite good. On my own boat, I've got anchor chain which is about 10 years old and starting to get a little bit worn. And I do use a silicone grease just to, I first of all wash all this down with fresh water, let it dry, and then I tend to use a light silicone spray on it, and especially around things like the drum here. So if you're not using this, it's worth making sure that this is actually secured so it can't actually be dropped off like it has here with the snubber. And then take this off here, so you're removing the galvanic reaction between the galvanising and the stainless. All right, well worth making sure that's all part of each other. Just end up with loads of corrosion in the gypsy. Developing.
All right. Fantastic advice. And is there a recommended age for anchor chain, or is it you just keep
looking at it? Keep looking at it. It's normally with anchor chain. It's the galvanising normally comes off before anything else. Yeah. Unfortunately. You would not believe how often I've gone to a claim where the boat or the forepeak area has been damaged by water, and 9 times out of 10 the anchor locker is full of mud underneath the chain, and we've had heavy rain, and no matter how good things are, the drains get blocked, or as in that case the water is intentionally designed to run into the anchor locker rather than overboard first, so there's always water pouring through that locker. But sometimes you'll find that the drain pipe from the recess gallery around the hatch to the side of the boat will sometimes be looped, and in the winter you get a bit of frost and it blows the fitting off, is a classic one, or the leaves, debris again, or rubbish gets into that, so it allows the water to come into the locker. And then, as I say, at the bottom you've got very small holes quite often, or you've got little caps on the outside, and you've only got to have one tidy sized leaf lay against that cap, and it will hold the water back for quite periods of time. So there we are. So where are we on there? We've done the anchor. Have we done the anchor locker? I don't know where we are with that one. Is that all that one, Kate? An anchor. Yeah, in a lot of boat yards, people drop the anchors off the boats as well. Okay, so it's really important if you're leaving a boat for a period of time. As you can see here, the water will drain into this anchor locker, so it's reliant on the drains at the bottom. So again, if it's possible, drop the whole lot over the side and make sure the bottom of the anchor locker is empty and clean and no mud in it, so that you know that whatever's going in there is emptying rather than filling up, because we have had claims before now where the anchor lockers are filled up and it's then come into the accommodation over a period of the winter. Okay. Sorry, Kate, I think I repeated myself on that one. Sorry, everyone, if I'm boring you. So I think those are all the ones on that slide, are they? Yeah. So this is a classic fitting that I photographed a couple of years ago, where the guy had actually used a screw, stainless steel screw, in the deck of a boat with balsa core. And internally, when I put the meter up, the resistance meter on the underside, nearly 1.5 foot of balsa core deck was absolutely saturated from it. And you know, it's just such a shame, because it would have been perfectly all right until that little clip had been fitted. So again, as we said earlier, just make sure you really do try and seal things off. Okay, what's the next one we got? Again, a lot of, I mean, when I first started boat building in Wistocks, every boat that came out the yard was mast off, guardrails off, and we used to put a hardback on, and then we used to put a really nice old tarpaulin, lorry tilt, which was tailored and cut and fit to the boat as part of the winterization. But one thing we would never do is we would never seal the boat up like this at the front here, because certainly on this boat, which is a wooden boat, starving the oxygen and airflow through the boat can be catastrophic in a wooden boat. And again, we've had, I've been to a number of claims over the years where people have stopped all ventilation through a boat, haven't got a dehumidifier going inside the boat, and lo and behold, you come back and find all the cushions, all the linings, head linings, everything is absolutely covered in a film of mold. Okay, so what's the next one there, Kate? So airflow is really important. And again, one of the things, unfortunately, we're suffering more and more with is boats blowing over. Only last week we had, I think, 8 boats or 9 boats blow over down in one of the Hamble boat yards where the winds were excessive. It's really important to make sure that the cradle that the boat you have goes into is actually fit for purpose. It correctly supports the boat. If in doubt, don't be frightened to put a few extra props around. Where you put supports, it's really important that there's actually something behind it. So in other words, don't put a prop up against the laminate where it can actually bend. Make sure you're putting props where there's framework internally inside the boat. You know, because you can actually do just as much damage by putting a prop in the wrong place than you can from not putting a prop. And again, do not, and this may sound really obvious, do not, if a boat yard has put your boat in a cradle, do not adjust that cradle or do anything to it without speaking to them. They should be the only ones that touch the cradle if it's theirs. Before now, we've actually had boats fall over where people have decided to move a prop because they didn't think it was in the right place, or worse still, they've decided to start stripping the antifoul off through the winter and have removed one of the legs of a cradle to find the boat fall down onto them. So I think that's pretty rocket science stuff, but again, it's worth saying it. Anything else on that one, Paul? No? Okay, so winterization of the engine. We'll start with the engine's end first.
Winterization. Again, I always think it's better to change the oil at the end of the season and start with fresh. On this particular boat, you've actually got a sump pump here, which is already fitted, which is really nice. So you can actually drain it and you can flush it and you can refill it. This is an indirect cooling system. So again, it's important to make sure the antifreeze in here is of the right strength and is not more than 2 or 3 years old, because if not, the inhibitors in here will start causing corrosion inside the block. And again, it's worth checking with your manufacturer. This, I'm not sure if this one has an anode fitted. I think that may be it there. But some of them have anodes as well. So it's important to make sure you check with your manufacturer to see if you need to change the anode on it. Okay, that's for galvanic protection. This one as well has got, while we're talking about things, this has got an anti-siphon which prevents the boat from hydraulicking, which has nothing to do with the winterization, but it's useful to check while you're actually playing with your engine if you've got one of those. And if you haven't, it's a nice little winter job to fit one. Again, just check your belts, protect the pulleys from corrosion through the winter, because engine rooms are always normally a bit of a damp area. If you have the luxury of a water maker like this one, again, make sure you have it properly pickled, and I would seek information from the actual manufacturers, because everyone's version of how to pickle it tends to vary between manufacturer. But if you don't, you'll end up with a right old mess come the spring.
And the shaft?
The shaft on this one is an unusual one. It's actually a V drive. So the engine is actually in backwards, and I actually can't see the stern gland arrangement because it's actually underneath here somewhere. Yeah, it's actually down here, and this one's got a deep sea seal, which you might want to try and get in and see there. But with those, again, they should be replaced every 7 years. If you're keeping the boat ashore, don't forget that a lot of them need what's called burping when you relaunch the boat. But generally, just keep an eye on them. 7 years is the general recommendation on those.
And I know this one's got a shaft, but are there different things to consider if you've got a sail drive or?
Yeah, certainly. You've got a lot of yachts that have sail drive units which go through the bottom of the boat, and again, generally, we all recommend about 7 years to change the seal. So again, if you're leaving the boat over a period of time, make sure that there's no obvious water ingress developing, and that the ring, the metal clamp ring, is not corroded, because that's always a good telltale that something's starting to develop.
And we saw a lot of emulsification with those if they're left in is that there's a seat with the seal?
The sail drive leg, yeah. The sail drive leg can cause that, but the only way you find that out normally is if the boat comes out of the water. Some of them you can dip the oil down into the leg, but not every model gives you that luxury. Okay, and again with diesel, it's really important to keep the fuel tanks topped up. Now, some people have diesel heaters on board a boat, so again it's important if you're running a diesel heater through the winter to actually try and ensure that the fuel is topped up on a regular basis, because you don't really want to be running your tank empty.
And with just a quick one for our sort of motor cruiser customers, is basically the principles exactly the same for motorboats as it is for yachts?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, basically, check your antifreeze, make sure it's the right strength, make sure it's not too old, and give the engine a good flush over wherever possible.
Okay, there's probably quite a lot to talk about in that one little video, but just to highlight a couple of things there. I talked about engine anodes, and stupidly I forgot to show you one. But basically, it's a nut with a piece of zinc fitted on the end, which will go inside your heat exchanger. And surprisingly, I mean, I change mine every year because my boat's out the water for 9 months a year out in Corfu, but I have spoken to quite a lot of people who change theirs on some of these forums, like the Sailing Cruising forum, where people change them every 6 months, and it's quite noticeable. If I was leaving the boat through the winter, I would be very tempted to do an autumn and spring change on an engine anode. It seems to be quite aggressive, especially if you've got shore power and everything else plugged in. Anything else on that one?
Yeah, hi Ben. It's just a question that's come in. There's been reports of sail drive gaskets cracking and failing prematurely in Greece. Would that be down to the high heat and being left for long periods? Is that so? Could they deteriorate quicker than the 7 years in that respect, I suppose?
So that's a very interesting question. I've actually been dealing with a couple of jobs out in Greece where there have been some quite interesting problems. Some of them are caused because the boats come out of the water for a long period of time. Like I say, with my own boat, she's out the water for 9 months of the year. So there's 9 months of air issues, and you can get the galvanic reactions and the corrosion of the amounts of salts that are in the water out there intensify the whole issue. Certainly temperature wise, I do think that some of our rubber qualities are not as good as they used to be 20-30 years ago. I mean, I've surveyed and looked at some boats with rubber exhaust hoses which are 40 years old and still perfect, and you go on another boat which is 10 years old and it's perished like you wouldn't believe. So I do think there are a few sort of other factors there, but normally rubber tends to break down where it's in a damp atmosphere, and then you've got the air attack on it.
And sort of noting what we've been through over the last 2 years and things like that, where people have left their boats for a sort of more extended periods than usual, again, could that affect the sort of time frame on longevity of these things?
Possibly. I haven't actually seen that sort of evidence of the rubber failing because it's been left longer, because it's designed to last at least 7 years. And there's stories of people who've checked them, and you take them out 7 years or 10 years and they still look perfect. But the trouble is, it's like everything else. You've only got to be the one owner that has the wrong one, and you'll be the one that's got an enormous claim as it goes down. I've had a couple of boats where the actual complete top hat moulding, which is the engine bed and the sail drive ring, are all glassed into the boat, where the builders use Bonder paste, and the moisture levels in the boat have been that high that the Bonder paste has lost its grab on the hull, and it hasn't been glassed with anything else. I have had a couple of boats where that mechanical bond of the paste has failed, and it has caused a problem there as well.
And another question has come in. What's your view on galvanic isolators?
Yes. And if you can afford an isolated transformer, spend the extra 700 quid on one of those. Certainly with shore power, there are some huge problems starting off. I've seen sail drives and drive legs on power boats absolutely eaten away. I think on my own YouTube, without trying to plug it too much, I've got some really good photographs and videos of galvanic and electrolytic attack. You see it more on narrow boats than you do, because the wiring on narrow boats is so diabolical compared to most production boats which hold an ISO mark. So the standard wiring has to be such. But one of the things, if you are fitting your own shore power, is to try and keep your AC and DC as far apart as possible all the way through. Incidentally, I did an interesting job on a boat recently where there was an earth fault, and it turned up to be the multi powered fridge freezer unit, which when it's plugged into shore power goes on to shore power AC, and when it's unplugged it recognises it's running on DC, so it clicks over. And there was an earth fault there, and there was a lovely bit of frequency running through the whole thing, which is causing a massive galvanic electrolytic problem to the boat. But definitely a galvanic isolator. If you can afford an isolator transformer, even better. Where do we go? Next one? Or yeah, right. So we talked about strainers. If your boat is in the water and you've got one of these, please make sure that it's actually above the water line. You will not believe how often I've been where the boat has had the Seacocks shut off. Sorry, it's been left open for the engine intake or the generator intake, which is the more common one that they're below the waterline. And that has frozen and actually split the ring cap. And then people have wondered why about 2 days after the thaw was come, their boat was sunk. What's the next one there? And this is a typical fracturing of the actual casing of the engine block from where the waterways have frozen. And again, if you're winterizing your engine, certainly if you've got the this one was in a power boat where the complete casing is fractured, and it's got a drive leg, so the raw water gets sucked in through the leg, circulated around the engine, and then chucked out back through the exhaust. So it hasn't got an internal indirect system. And so what's happened in this case is, although the guy flushed the engine quite well, what he hadn't realised was the fact that there was silt building up in the bottom of the engine lining. So as we had a very heavy frost a couple of years ago, and we had sub-zero temperatures for about a week, all that silt and stuff in the bottom of the engine waterways actually just fractured the side of the lining out. So again, when you're flushing your engines, flush them for a good 20 minutes. There are drain downs on the side of most engines. You can remove the drain plugs to allow the water to drain down on the direct systems. And again, just make sure that there's no debris and stuff inside. One of the manufacturers, I think it's actually in the winterization recommendations, says to use a piece of wire as a hook and pass it into the waterways to see if you can yank out any rubbish and debris. So that's an interesting thing. Myself, my dad used to always use a bit of antifreeze and flush through the last sort of couple of minutes of running an engine with an antifreeze mixture. Even on the raw water systems, you can set up a jury rig if you're a yacht. My dad actually used to have a bucket, galvanized bucket, which he used to hang over the exhaust discharge area. So he used to collect the exhaust water. And he used to have a hose which he used to then run back to the water intake, and he used to use a rag and a stick and used to force the hose into the water intake. As long as you haven't got one of those grills over the front of it, it works really well. And he used to literally put a 50-50 mix in and used to run the engine like that for 15-20 minutes, which is a great way of doing it. So there we are. So sorry, Kate. Yeah, if you want to go on to the next one, which is the dreaded diesel bug, we talked about in the film there of making sure your tanks are fully pressed. Not only must you really want to try and make sure your tanks are fully pressed, you also want to make sure that your fuel cap is well greased if it's one of these flush caps. I'm just about to show a video in a minute of one that actually happened to my own boat. But this is a classic example of a really good bit of diesel bug going on from one of the tanks we drained off. If you've got a large power boat of more than, say, 300 or 400 litres per tank, so you're carrying 600 or 700 litres of fuel, it's well worth looking at getting a polishing system fitted into your boat. And I probably shouldn't say, but one of the companies in the UK, Marine 16, do what's called a diesel dipper, where you can constantly yank fuel and debris from the bottom of your tank and water, because what causes a lot of this is the fact that we're on biofuel, and any bit of water will help that bio element of the fuel start to grow wonderful bits and pieces. And some of it actually in stainless steel tanks can be quite corrosive. So it's really important to try and do it. On my own boat, when I had a new fuel tank made, I've got it made with a V to the bottom, then I've got a lovely little drain down the tap, which I put a secondary bung in, so when the tap's off, it's got no chance of dripping. And then the fuel itself is picked up about 4 inches above that. But when we go out for the spring, I will drain off 2 or 3 litres just to make sure there's nothing in there. I regularly use a diesel bug treatment to condition the fuel. And then likewise, when we go sailing, every couple of weeks, I'll, especially if we've been sailing through anything bad, I will drain off the tank again just to make sure that anything that's been agitated on those sloping areas has come to the bottom and has been pulled out. And so far, touch wood, this last 2 years, it's been good, and we've sailed in some pretty horrendous weather going out to Corfu. But as I say, diesel bugs are real bane, and it's going to get worse, unfortunately. There's actually a new problem where the fuel on modern engines gets cycled back to the fuel tank through the fuel rails and is much warmer. And we've actually had a couple of owners who've now managed to produce some really good soap from this biofuel. They haven't started selling it yet, but my goodness me, it is literally like a pure soap that is coming out of the filters. So if you get a white soapy filter, you haven't got diesel bug, but you're producing soap from the quality of the fuel, which is really poor. Right.
Ben, just before we go to that, there's just been a question coming in. What does make sure your tanks are fully pressed mean?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, full. As full as you possibly can. Sorry, it's an old survey term. Make sure everything is pressed, fully pressed, is make sure all your tanks are absolutely brimmed. Your uncle would know that term. Sorry. Yeah. Right. So let's go and see what happened to
really
me.
Wet winter here in Swansea Marina, and I'm suffering with the dreaded deck filler that's been leaking into our fuel tank and caused a bit of diesel bug. If I take you down here and show you, you'll see I've already unscrewed it and I've taken it out because I'm going to be putting a new one in. Basically the problem, as I wrote in Yachting Monthly, and that is these shoulders here and these O-rings don't particularly seal very well, and even though we greased this one this year, it's already, the O-ring has actually broken down in under a year. I don't know if I can get a close enough look on that O-ring, but you can see the problems with it. And
I'm sure someone will say it's because I use grease and not silicone oil.
This is the new one. This is the new one. Unfortunately, it's tapered at the top, which means I've had to clean the hole out. And something worth mentioning is if you are doing deck jobs, make sure that if you have got balsa core like I have here, that you seal this all up before you fit your deck fitting, because if not, you'll end up with a rotten deck. So that's going to go down into there on a bedding mastic and 3 stainless steel screws. What I really like with these caps is the fact that they actually cover the whole of the deck fitting, and they've got an O-ring in there, but also the cap in itself has a double seal on it underneath there, so that when you wind that down, that is completely watertight, so there's less chance of getting any water in my wretched fuel. And just to show you the state of our fuel, Doesn't matter how good your husbandry is, you can probably just see those murky bits in the bottom there coming round, and that has all happened in under 6 months since we left Milford at the start of this year.
So I hope you find that useful. I've got loads of little useful tips like that on my channel, but
I was going to say, Ben, that's not Corfu.
no, that was Swansea Marina before we were halfway through the refit. So we did a lot of the refit down in Nayland, and then we took the boat up to Cardiff, where we just finished off and re-rigged it before we chucked on a lorry to Port Napoleon. Yeah, so anyway, what's really interesting is the fact there are those fuel caps I had on my boat are almost on everyone's production boat, but honestly, the sooner you can change them over to a better cap, the better it will be for your fuel management. This one, although this is a photograph of a gas locker on a narrow boat, it's still very relevant to anyone in yachts. I quite regularly find that there are gas lockers out there which are leaking into people's accommodation. You can buy gas sniffers very cheaply from some of the hardware shops and online things, and there's some very good bilge gas alarms, but this gas locker is quite relevant in the sense that only last week I went to look at a yacht which was GRP, and the gas hose drain overboard was actually not connected underneath, so any gas fumes were going straight into the engine compartment. This one, all I say to people is at the start of the season and at the end of the season, do what I call my notorious bucket test, which is grab a bucket of water, pour it in, and see if the water comes out. And again, on yachts, make sure that the hose is actually running directly down without any constrictions or U-bends in them, because if you've got a U-bend, gas cannot pass through water. So I hope you find that useful. Okay, let's kick on to the next one. Seacocks. I think I'm fairly well known for talking about Seacocks. This is a classic one that's failed, where the dezinkification is actually in the hose tail. This actually fractured off where the boat had a freezing of water, and the ice had actually pumped the fitting apart. Again, be very careful with Seacocks. If you're leaving your boat in the water, really, you should turn all the Seacocks off. But you need to make sure that there is an element of warmth through the boat with ball valves, because when you turn a ball valve off, you're actually trapping a small amount of water in the valve body. And if we get down to what I call serious sub-zero temperatures, that section of water that's been trapped in the body of the valve can actually push and fracture the actual valve body if it's in poor condition. So one of the things I've always said to people is, please make sure you change your Seacocks at least every 5 years, because a lot of the galvanic deterioration of Seacocks and skin fittings and the hose tails in this case, you physically cannot see until it goes, because as you can see from this photograph, the corrosion and the deterioration of that fitting is actually in the actual internal walls. As you can see, the actual wall of the fitting itself internally looks lovely, but it's not possible. And I love when people scrape and they say, "Oh yes, it's not pink." Yeah, unless you break the fitting in half, you won't really know how bad it is. So please look at changing fittings every 5 years minimum. Okay, Galley, I think. Should we plug on with that one?
And so moving on to the Galley, we've got obviously the fridges, gas systems, all that sort of thing. Same again, or?
Yeah, so everyone forgets about the fridge.
We did.
Yeah, we do, yeah. So again, it's always a good idea to leave them slightly open. Obviously make sure they're switched off and everything's dry inside. With the gas, generally there's not a lot you can do with the gas, but it's a good idea to try and disconnect the bottle perhaps. And also have a look at the age of the gas hose, because that's always the one that everyone says they changed last year, and they get a bit of a shock when they realise it's actually 6 or 7 years old. And again, don't forget to look at the gas hose behind here, which should be a flexi arm cable. It should be changed every 5 years. But generally speaking, with gas, probably a light, you know, some cooking oil or vegetable oil or something, just lightly over the stainless steel will stop any little bits of corrosion developing over the winter.
And there are drains at the bottom of the fridge, are there? So
Not every time.
Not every time. Okay.
Not every builder puts them in. Some do, some don't.
Make it easier.
And if you do have a drain, it's amazing how often they normally end up blocked anyway.
Oh yeah, that's true.
You know.
bit of bread.
Yeah, yeah.
So with drains, it's amazing actually how dirty those drain holes become and how smelly they become. So it's always worth using a light bleach or a Milton's or something through them and make sure they're clean. They normally drain into the bilge sump, so it's always worth having a look around. Right, we'll crack on with the heads if there's no questions. Oh yeah, this is a photograph of a sink mixer tap that had actually got water left in it because the system hadn't been drained down, and actually blew the head of the tap off, which is quite smart. Okay.
And now on to the most important room, the head.
Heads. Yes, it's always amazing how many yachts these days have porcelain bowls, isn't it?
Yes.
And again, it's amazing how many people forget to drain that last little bit of water out the bottom on the bend. So again, it's always a good idea to try and drain as much water out as possible because there is a risk if you get to sub-zero temperatures that they could create a bit of a crack in the porcelain, which you may not be aware of until you go sailing.
It's always an embarrassing moment.
It is always a good moment. So yeah, and again, things like the drains out of the sink and even out of the bilge pump, just make sure that the shower sump is dry as well, because again, there's a bit of a bend in those to the pump. So all those sort of little things that frost can get in the pipe work and start pushing things apart. It's well worth having a look around. Just spend a little bit of time working through the boat, really.
And is it worth leaving the bilge pump running on throughout the winter if you're in the water?
Most bilge pumps should be automatic anyway when you're not on board. And again, making sure all the Seacocks off is always a good one, apart from the cockpit drains. If you have the luxury of cockpit drains with Seacocks on.
Yeah, and the other thing we should talk about is ventilation through the boat, which I think we'll do when we come to the upholstery. But like in the heads there, you've got several cupboards which are all shut, and it's worth making sure that everything's there with an airflow wherever possible, so it helps dry the boat out. And a little bit of background heat is always good. It's amazing how, especially with some of these modern flushing loos, how bits of water get held in the pipe work and fracture themselves. Right, we'll hit the dreaded water tanks, I think. Yeah, so there's a classic tap that had been dripping, you know, and just imagine the damage that the water's doing in the pipe work.
And so, what about the water system?
Okay, so generally, I think it's always a good idea to drain water systems off if you're not using them. So make sure they're well empty, flush the tanks, make sure everything's nice and dry. Good opportunity to take the water pump impeller out if you've got that type of system. This is the clarifier, which is basically what creates your hot water from the engine, and also this one's got a shore power connection. And again, it's really important to drain these down if you're not using them in the winter, because there is always a risk of, if any water's in there, 5 or 6 gallons of water can be in there, that they freeze. No, they're not always in the engine compartment. I imagine this engine compartment has actually probably got a tiny little heater somewhere, but I haven't found it yet. Yeah, but again, if you haven't got any heat anywhere near it, it's a very good thing to do, because there is a high risk of creating a fracture in those tanks.
And even if the water tanks are drained down, is it still advisable to have a heater running?
I think it's always a nice thing to have a little bit of background heat in the boat. The problems we've got with dehumidifiers against ventilation is the fact if you go run a dehumidifier, you've got to use the right type in the boat. It's really important to use one that's actually suitable for yachts and motorboats, that type of environment, not one for a house, because they run in a completely different way. Whereas ventilation, I mean, from the days of my dad's boatyard, everything was vented through, and we used to, I mean, jokingly, we used to have a little 40-watt light bulb in a tin box underneath the engine on a timer, you know. But I mean, things have moved on. There's lots of people get these oil heaters now, very cheap, sticking them on a time clock or sticking them on on the FOSStat of about 5-6 degrees, and they'll just tick over all day long.
Just keeps the ambient temperature above freezing.
Just keep it above freezing if you can. Saves a lot of grief in the future.
Yeah.
And just a question coming in, Ben, are there any special considerations for holding tanks?
Yeah, I mean, I always make sure that our holding tank is empty and again, is well and truly flushed out. So there's no chance of any water trapped anywhere, because that can be quite a smelly discovery in the spring. Certainly, it's very sensible to do that. If you're floating in the boat, obviously it's difficult, but just making sure that those sort of things are not holding loads of stuff inside them, like grey tanks and black tanks. Obviously you're putting the boat to bed for the winter. All those sort of things should be drained out. Interestingly enough, with the clarifier, if you do an antifreeze change on your engine, don't forget that you've got a loop of water running through the system in the clarifier there. So you do need to make sure that, especially if they're above the engine like that one was, that you fill up to that and work through it as well to get rid of the air. And I saw your face when we talked about the 40-watt light bulb, but honestly, my dad, we never, we used to have very old diesel, well, the newer diesel engines in those days, the old Listers and Saabs and Petters, but I mean, we never used to have a problem of a cracked head. And it's just, just try and find a way of providing a nice little bit of ambient heat these days. Will save a lot of money to you guys in the future. Where are we up to? Upholstery, I guess, is it? Yeah.
And what about the upholstery? Is there anything we should be considering for that?
Well, certainly with material like leather, like we have here, there's not an awful lot you can do. But if you look carefully on the walls, on the forward bulkhead here, you can actually see a bit of damp actually already in this boat from where it's raining today, and we've just got that humidity. So again, trying to keep boats dry and a little bit of background heat is good. And again, we've got the port light directly over the top of this upholstery, so if there are a leak occurring, it's going to end up on the furniture. So it's well worth, if you can remove cushions and stand them upright, or put them in areas where the air can get around them, so much the better really. But when they're fixed like these ones,
or take them home.
And again, in the sort of cabins and things like that, lift them up. So
yeah, the bunks. Yeah, you try and stand things vertically to let some air through, and don't be frightened to take the hatches off all the bunks and put them cross hatched so that there's air able to breathe through the boat. And my old man would have also said, let's take the carpets up and open up a couple of sole boards and let some ventilation go through the bottom of the boat as well.
Yeah, and if you want a good little trick as a surveyor. If you've got a mobile phone and you set it on flash and it's not particularly bright in the boat, and you take some nice flash photographs on your mobile phone, you'll quite quickly see where there's water coming down bulkheads and framework from port lights, or from the classic one actually is the deck mast fittings and things like that, where the grommets sometimes perish out. So you can sometimes spot damp quickly with a mobile phone, just flashing around with a camera. I'm always amazed when doing survey work. You look at some things and they look okay, but when you look at them with the camera, suddenly you see that with a flash, you can see more quickly what's going wrong. And it's a really good little tip. But if you can get things like your upholstery off the boat quickly and somewhere nice and dry, get all the ropes. Cockpit lockers, I tell you what, cockpit lockers, I can spot a cockpit locker with a moisture meter or resistance meter from the outside without even knowing the deck plan of the boat, because and where people have left bunk duvet covers stuffed inside the locker, because they all just gather moisture and they just hold moisture against the hull, and you'll be there with your meter and you'll just flip off the scale for a minute and you'll go and have a look and you'll take all that stuff out and you put the meter on and it's still running high because all that stuff is getting into the laminates from the inside. So it's really important to try and remove as much of what I call the debris of sailing acquisitions as much as possible from your lockers and from within the bunker arrangements. Pillows are notoriously wet. And again, I've recently done a project boats thing where we went into the forepeak of this boat where the chain lock had been leaking, and there was 3 sails in there absolutely saturated. So just please think about all those sort of things, Are we think we're done on these, are we, Paul?
I'll have to double check, but there have been a couple of questions coming in saying, what is the difference, asking about the difference between a domestic and a marine dehumidifier?
Yeah, I hate this question. It is important to use the right type. A marine dehumidifier works in the sense there are a couple of options there, but one of them I think is a desiccant. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of them is a desiccant unit, which doesn't rely on so much background heat, whereas a domestic dehumidifier works in a different way and relies on quite a lot of background heat. So if your boat is sitting there at sort of sub 5 degrees, that dehumidifier is not going to work. And we've actually had boats catch fire with the wrong type of dehumidifier in the boat. So it's really important to make sure you buy one that's fit for purpose.
So the marine ones basically just go down to a lower temperature and are more designed for purpose, really.
It's a different method of extracting the moisture from the atmosphere, more than going down to different temperature. It's a completely different method of extraction.
Okay. And just
and
with
actually,
regard,
before we go on that one, the classic one that I've seen is people have run dehumidifiers. They've put the thing on so it fills the bucket up. So after literally a week, they've got a bucket full of water, and then the dehumidifier stops working. Or the other classic one is they've put it in the galley sink, but they've shut the galley sink valve off. So again, the dehumidifiers work for about a month. It's filled up the bucket inside the dehumidifier, and it's filled up the hose to the discharge and the double bowl drainer before it's then started to flood the boat. So if you are going to use a dehumidifier and you're running it into a sink drain, make sure the galley sink is actually open.
There's a perfect piece of advice there. Okay, so we're going to move on to a question and answer session now. We've got a couple of questions already in. First one being, what is your opinion of True Design Seacocks? Good
question. I actually quite like the True Design. I also like Marilon. I've grown up probably a bit more with the Marilons for the last 15, 20 years. True Design are made in New Zealand, I believe, and I've seen them on quite a lot of boats. To be honest with you, using either the Marilon or the True Design is, and I probably get shot by someone who sells DZR fittings, but I do think they are more reliable. If you maintain them properly and you get rid of this massive galvanic problem, because quite often people will change a ball valve from a gate valve in say like an old Moody or Westerly, and they'll leave the through hull fitting, which is bronze, which is great, but when they put the DZR valve on, the taper threads are different, and then sometimes can be incompatible because one's tapered and one's square. And so when you're changing any fitting, you really should change the whole lot. Don't get tempted into doing half a job. And what's great with the True Design and the Marilons are you cannot use them onto your old skin fittings. So it eliminates one of the biggest problems that we have in the first place, which is going onto old bits of kit. So from that, they're really good. Again, with the True Designs, one thing you've got to watch is the installation of them. Where you mustn't have more than 1 to 1.5 times the diameter of the pipe exposed within the internal hull area, because if not, you can sometimes create a bit of a lever which can start to flex the fitting. So like everything else, if they're installed correctly, they're brilliant.
And what's the main difference between them? Just that. So obviously you've got the ones that you spoke about before. What's the difference between the True Design one?
Well, between the True Design and the Marilon, it's more the fact that True Design, majority of the True Design ones are almost like a like for like against a normal ball valve arrangement, whereas the Marilon ones are made where they actually press against the hull more, so there's no leverage issue. They're both made from what's called a composite material, and the servicing of them is really very minimal. They like to be used. That's something that's really important. You must keep operating them, even if you're saying they don't need operating. Yes, keep turning them every time you go on off the boat. when they're out the water, a little bit of silicone grease on the insides or whatever. I think they say silicone grease just to do them, and just keep an eye on them. But I think I only know of one particular failure on a true design, and I know of 1 or 2 failures on Marlon compared to probably 500 or 600 failures in the last 20 years on normal DZR stuff. So from a reliability point of view, like everything, it's looking after them, but they are certainly more reliable.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I hope that answers the questions. The next one is, when you drain your calorifier, should you remove the power to it?
Yes, good point. Make sure the trip is off if it's drained down. I actually, that's a really good point, and perhaps I should have mentioned that earlier. But yes, all power should be disconnected from things like that when you're not using. And it'll be on a trip switch. You'll have an independent trip on the RCD for that, so it's well worth making sure that's tripped down.
And possibly a very quick one here: mast up or down when storing ashore?
Oh,
I thought it was going to be quick.
Okay, I personally think that I go back to the old days of when I was first in the boatyard. It was always mast down. Always mast down. You can take all your rigging off, go and put it away nicely out of the elements, wash all the running rigging, mouse everything, and great. The downside of that these days are a lot of the places where people store their boats don't have what I call the proper mast racks. In the days when I worked at Wistocks, we used to have a beautiful mast rack facility where masts were all independently racked and labelled. I think once we actually accidentally put the wrong mast on the wrong westerly centaur, and it was only halfway through the season the guy said, "I'm sure my gooseneck wasn't here last year," or he'd put a different fitting on. But generally speaking, they were all labelled, and there's some really good boatyards out there which still do that good service, and it will make the longevity of all the stuff last a lot better. The trouble is these days you'll see quotes of 400 or 500 quid to put a mast up and down, if not more, especially when you've got radars and everything else on. And that's why it's so important that if you are leaving the mast up, you've got to make sure that you have the boat correctly supported, take all the sails off. I would personally get some nice tidy mousing lines and take all the running rigging off wherever possible. That is, as you say, not a quick question, but I hope that gives a fairly quick answer to it.
And what about rigging and that sort of thing? Should that be loosened off or kept tight, or if the mast is up, obviously?
Generally speaking, if you're leaving the mast up, it should be slightly detensioned. What people tend to forget, and we all have this thing in our heads of mast standing rigging should be looked at with a view to replace it 10 years. What's interesting is everyone says it's the insurance companies that say it, and all the insurance companies say it's the surveyors that say it. But the trouble is, it's a common sense thing, because the trouble with stainless is you cannot really tell when it's going to fail. And if any of you guys have got rod rigging, forget what I'm talking about. With 10 years, the balls on the joints need to be looked at every 5 years, because they can have massive crevice corrosion problems. And certainly it's important to detension the rig on anything that's got rod rigging. But for the normal cruiser like myself these days, being sensible with your rig does help. But again, I've always looked at putting a couple £100 away in a pot somewhere, so that come the 10th year, I've actually got some money to one side to start doing it, because I don't know what your personal company policies are, but some companies will only pay up to 50% of the rig if it's over 10 years old. Others will do an age-related claim on it. And a lot of us have got to realise that, give you an example, a couple of years ago, I did a 30-foot yacht, which was 25 years old. It was only worth 15,000. The guy lost the rig with all the sails up. Luckily, no one was hurt. But the quote to replace that standing rig with the sails and everything was nearly 11,500, 12,000. So the boat actually was at the point of write-off. Does that help that question?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, another one just coming in. Is it recommended to take my boat out of the water over winter? They have a twin-keeled boat, and so can land on a beach to check the hull.
Okay, so I'm assuming they're GRP. It would be nice to know how old the boat is. So if they want to quickly type back in that one while I ramble on for 2 seconds. Basically, if the boat is osteopathic resins or the old-fashioned polyesters, the more the boat is out in the water, the better it is for the boat.
1995.
Yes. So I would be definitely looking at having her out the water every winter now, because the more you can keep the moisture levels down in old resins, the better. There's been some quite interesting studies done on the fact that laminates start to weaken after about 25 years where the moisture is excessive. And I think, I'm not going to try and plug my YouTube too much, but there are some great videos on there of what happens where the hull starts to soften. And if any of you guys have ever come to the Southampton Boat Show and seen my talk, there's some great photographs there of where the laminate has actually softened so much the yacht was actually on the mooring and the keel just naturally fell off from the oscillation effect of where working the laminate after 35, 40 years. So yeah, the sooner the boat, keeping the boats dry, really important, especially on the inside.
And what is an excessive moisture reading?
Yes, right. Well, basically, this is going to probably upset quite a few people, but
Try not to.
all of us surveyors use meters, which are basically called moisture meters, but if you look at them, they don't actually say moisture meter on them anywhere. They say either resistance or impedance or something like that. So as a surveyor, we look at the meter and do comparative readings. Now, I've always hit a boat with a ball peen hammer, light one, very small one, and you can start to hear the laminate losing its crispness as you tap it. Using a nice little bit of masking tape over the top of the ball so it doesn't mark the boat below the waterline anyway. But that works quite nicely, and you can start to hear it. The telltale signs, again, when you set the boat down, if you see it sloping over the keel, and when you lift the boat, you'll start to see the fact the boat lifts before the keel goes up. That's always a good clue that there's something going on with the laminate. Again, they're on my videos, but generally speaking, the current thinking is that when the laminate is round about the 25% plus, the laminate has lost about 25 to 30% of its strength. So I think that's roughly where we are. But the only real way to tell the levels of moisture in a laminate are, and wait for it, is to take a core sample and send it off to a lab, which no one really wants to pay for. But visual signs and experience will normally tell me and a lot of the other surveyors that there is an issue. And the classic one is you start seeing loads of large blisters starting to appear on the side of your hull.
I think we've got 2 more questions, which we'll quickly whiz through now. Well, I don't want to say quickly. They could be longer answers. You never know. When draining the fresh water, the pump instructions say do not run dry. So how do you get all the water out?
Yeah, great one that, isn't it? It depends on the water pump you've got, but a lot of people will disconnect the water from the actual pump face. So they'll drain down as much as they can until you hear the pump just starting to do that little gurgle, at which point they'll stop, and then they'll undo the fitting off the water pump and run it from there.
And lastly, I think everything we've obviously discussed is all about how to put it to bed for the winter. Obviously, when we come to the beginning of next season, we obviously need to reverse all this, don't we? So any sort of quick and helpful tips, or is it just a question of just putting it back in the water and getting it all sorted out?
I think the winterization is really important, is just as important as winterization, and doing your spring checks of making sure that there's no corrosion on your drive belts and pulley belts, and the engine is suitable to turn over. Don't just chuck it in the water and press the button and think it's going to turn over. A lot of people get away with it, but proper winterization of the engine and making sure that you just give it that little rock by hand before you press the button, if you can, is always worth doing. But there are loads of things that really, I mean, I think we chatted yesterday about the fact perhaps we ought to do a spring webinar and do what I call the reversal of this one.
And one thing you mentioned on the one we did before about the impeller, to change that at the beginning of the season rather than at the end.
Yeah, the all water impeller, it's well worth changing that at the start of the season. I always take my impeller out at the end of the season. But to be honest with you, because I leave my boat for so long, I tend to find that by the time I've looked at it and it's sat outside, you think, oh, there's a couple of little cracks on there. Do you know what? It's 40 odd quid. Let's just buy a new one and put it in, and I've got another spare. So currently I've now got 3 spare impellers. But, you know, you've got to ask yourself sometimes, I know we try and do boating on a budget, but sometimes by doing boating too much on a budget can actually cost you more in the long term. And sometimes accepting the fact that for maintenance, you need to think about anode kits, you need to think about impeller kits, you need to think about all those bits and pieces. And we talked about batteries, you know, of storing batteries through the winter. You know, you need to think of what you're going to spend as to what you're expecting. And for me, because as I say, my old boat is in Corfu now, you know, spending a lot of money on expensive batteries wasn't a priority for me, because I couldn't see how I was going to regularly maintain them. So I've just got a tidy set of leisure ones and a good cranking battery on her. And you know, if I get 4 years out of those, then I've done really well. If I get 2 years out, then I'm okay. But so far, you know, we've got 3 years out of them, and they're still okay. But I have got a charging system, which does a discharge and recharge looping system on it. But you know, all those sort of things are really important to think about of what you're going to spend and what you're going to save long term.
And this is going to be a bit of technical phrasing. Someone's asked us a question: how about fogging a diesel engine?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes. Yeah, but just make sure that you understand that come the spring to make sure it's all. When you first start it, there's going to be quite a bit of a smell, and you're absolutely right. All those sort of things are good. What you've just got to watch now is sometimes you've got to watch what you're using to fog it, because to basically spray an inhibitor over the whole engine is what we're talking about when we say fogging, because there are some bits of neoprenes and plastics and stuff used on some manufacturers which don't like it. So before you go and start discharging a great big tin of something over it, you know, if it's a Beta, give the guys a ring at Beta. If it's a Perkins or a Volvo or whatever, or a Nanny, you know, just ring the helpline and say, is it all right to use this product? Because sometimes they say, I'm glad you asked me that. No. But me, old-fashioned school, yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And we've just had some sage advice over from one of our watchers. Is it's always safer to do it whilst on the mooring than to do it out at sea. There you go. That's always good advice.
And plenty of spares. Never have enough spares.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's it for the questions. Thank you very much, everybody, for all your input. Thank you for staying with us, and thank you for listening in. Apologies for the earlier technical issues. I hope we sorted all those out, and I know the volume was certainly better from my end at the end, so good on that. A huge thank you to Alan at Berthon for allowing us to use the boat. A huge thank you also to Chris and Kate at the Knot Agency, who put together all the videos and all the presentation, which has been hugely appreciated. And lastly but not leastly, a huge thank you to Ben, who's given us his time, his expertise. I mean, it's not very often you get to sort of share with this sort of experience and expertise, and we hope you've all enjoyed it and found it not educational, because that sounds a bit dull, but entertaining and educational. Kind of, let's go there. So again, thank you very much, and we'll call it there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And I shouldn't really probably plug it, but I write for a couple of yachting magazines, and all I'm interested in is making sure everyone has a safe and enjoyable time on the boat. Hence the reason why I've done my YouTube. It's not to make any money out of it. I just want to impart, well, it's not just my 40 plus years of knowledge, but it's the knowledge I've gained from my father, my uncle, my brother. So thanks for all coming.
And you'll see our contact details if you need us at the bottom there.
Cheers. Thank you.